Погибла женщина с ребенком, 5-е, 10-е, туда-сюда. Я говорю, слушай, вот это сделал я. У меня смотрят такими глазами. Я говорю, мне по-другому не получилось. Мне надо было людей своих сохранить.
General Andrei Gurulyov, a member of the Russian State Duma, who you're surely familiar with thanks to his frequent appearances on various propaganda talk shows, admitted on air that in 2014 he took part in the war in Donbas, and that the Russian troops under his command shelled and killed civilians. Gurulyov himself admitted that he gave the order to shell a church where civilians were hiding. As a result of that shelling, a woman and her child were killed.
Да, Соловьев говорит, мы не воюем с мирным населением, мы не занимаемся мародерством. Это правда. Но, к сожалению, сопутствующие потери не всегда есть. Они есть, от них никуда не денешься. 12 лет назад я как-то заехал там в одну церковь на сопредельной территории и подошел к священнику. Говорю, отец, как дела? Да вот, нас тут разбомбили, тут стреляли, там погибла женщина с ребенком, 5-е, 10-е, туда-сюда. Я говорю, слушай, вот это сделал я. У меня смотрят такими глазами.
Wow, what admissions we are seeing on Russian airwaves. Huh. Ukrainian journalists and international investigative reporters wrote about the fact that this General Gurulev commanded Russian troops in Donbas and took part in combat operations in 2014 and 2015 as far back as 10 years ago. Information about this was published, and investigations were reported. But back then, as we remember, Russian propaganda claimed that none of it was true, that we'd made it all up, that we were inventing things. There was no Russian army in Donbas. Instead, local militiamen, miners, and tractor drivers were fighting there. This was all a civil war, an internal conflict, and the Russian army wasn't taking part in it. Remember how Putin would constantly blink when asked, "So, are you fighting there?" He'd say, "No, we are not fighting. There are none of them there. Our soldiers aren't there. There is no Russian aggression. It's just that some people, workers and peasants, have risen up in Donbas and formed militia units. They're the ones fighting there. Our people aren't even there." And now, 12 years later, not just a Russian soldier, but a high-ranking military commander, yes, a full-fledged general, who is now also a deputy, admits that he not only took part in these hostilities and commanded Russian troops there, but also actually admits to killing a woman and her child. Did you really think it was some Moscovoy or Dremov who was in charge of these so-called militia units? Or maybe Zakharchenko, God has mercy. Or maybe Besler. They were simply shown on TV as militia leaders, as if they were the ones who formed the units there and were fighting the Ukrainian army, bravely holding the defense. But in reality, here you go. No one is even trying to hide who is actually fighting anymore. The regular Russian army was fighting. People like Gurulyov were in command, while all these Moscovoys, Dremovs, and the like were just giving interviews, posing for the cameras, and playing the role of military commanders. As if they were actually in charge there and commanding something.
Я говорю, мне по-другому не получилось. Мне надо было людей своих сохранить. Мы пытались от больницы зайти, от областной. Не получилось. Пытались там с севера зайти тоже. Пришлось бить так и добивать противника до конца.
He just says he couldn't have done it other way. He had to save his own people. You know, those very same Russian military, who cowardly and sneakily, yeah, on the quietly, invaded Ukraine, pretending they weren't even there. So, to avoid getting caught, and to keep the death toll from getting too high, they had to be saved, but a woman with a child didn't need to be saved. Like, whatever, they're just some Donbas residents anyway, and who in Russia even needs them? Nobody gives a damn about them. They're not worth pitying. Anyway, later their deaths were pinned as Ukrainian military casualties anyway. They said that once again, those terrible Ukrainian fascists had shelled and massacred the residents of Donbas. Look, Putin is still coming out and shouting, for 8 years, Ukrainians have been killing the people of Donbas. And now look, time has passed, and it turns out it wasn't the Ukrainians, actually, but this General Gurulyov.
Я тебя не прошу, чтобы там люди меня простили, еще что-то. Я просто хочу, чтобы ты людям донес правду на проповеди. Меня, если надо, Бог простит. Значит, нет, так значит нет, не заслужил. Но люди правду должны знать. И он смотрел на меня изумленными глазами. Говорит, я все понял. Но это война, ничего не сделаешь. Мне не жалко того ребенка с женщиной, которые погибли. Скорее всего, под нашим огнем. Этот снаряд тут отошел, и все на этом. Конечно, жалко. Но сегодня они живут нормальной жизнью. Сегодня они уже с тех времен совершенно по-другому себя позиционируют.
He says, "Of course, I feel sorry for the people I killed, but at least today they're living normal lives." Well, of course, the slow-witted general didn't quite mean to say that. He just formulates his thoughts that way because of his limited intellect. But you have to admit, it turned out to be symbolic. It's clear that what he meant was that the rest of the Donbas residents, who were lucky enough to survive this so-called liberation, are living normal lives, right? But for those who weren't so lucky, those who didn't survive it, they, of course, no longer have any kind of life. Neither a normal one nor an abnormal one, and, frankly, even for those who did survive, you still can't say they're living any kind of normal life. Of course, there's no way to call their lives normal, because what's been going on in Donbas for the last 12 years, ever since people like the Gurilevs arrived there and, yes, and how it was defended, well, that has absolutely nothing to do with a normal life.
Понятно, что там тоже проблем своих хватает, мало не кажется. Но это война. И надо бить противника везде и всюду. В Киеве. Чтобы не было ни воды, ни света, ни канализации, ничего не было.
And, as usual, General Gurulev then proceeded to call for strikes against civilians and for the creation of a humanitarian catastrophe in Kiev. Well, there's nothing new here. He makes these calls in every single one of his speeches. So, basically, it turns out that he's simply calling for revenge against some Ukrainian civilians cause he killed other Ukrainian civilians 12 years ago. So, that's literally the logic of this war right now. But overall, of course, nothing surprising is going on. This is exactly what I predicted and warned about. Those who have been following me for a long time, who have been reading and watching my content for a long time, remember that back in 2014 to 2015, I said that sooner or later they would admit the truth anyway. Sooner or later, they'll stop hiding the fact that Russia took part in the war in Donbas and that there was no internal conflict between Donbas and Kiev. Rather, there was Russian aggression against Ukraine right from the very beginning. At first, they lied and said they weren't in Crimea, but Putin quickly admitted that there were Russian troops there. Then he denied for a long time that they weren't in Donbas, but now we see that they're even admitting they were in Donbas. In other words, sooner or later they got tired of hiding it. And now even Russian generals, yes, the very ones who commanded those Russian troops back then, are admitting that this was no civil war at all, but rather the Russian army invading Ukraine, and not only that, but also firing on civilians, fighting very mercilessly, even killing women and children. Can you remember how Russian propaganda was going all out back in 2014? There was a flood of reports about punishers, about fascists, about how brutal the Ukrainian military, the National Guard, as they called it, was, and how they showed no mercy towards civilians, deliberately shooting at them. These fascists, they hate the people of Donbas. How this hatred toward Ukraine was stoked back then, right? How did all this demonization start? The idea that there are some kind of inhuman monsters out there, that is, punitive forces sent specifically to destroy the civilian population in Donbas. There were so many stories about crucified boys and so on, right? And look, yes, while they were airing these stories, at that very moment the Russian army, under the command of generals like the Gurulevs, was actually shelling civilians, actually killing them. But not a single Russian war correspondent, not a single Russian news channel, said a word about it. No one said that the Russian army was fighting there. No one said that it was killing civilians. And look, they have no complaints to them at all. In other words, the very things they cursed the Ukrainians for, calling for everyone here to be killed, calling us fascists, they forgive their own army for without any problem. Yes, so why did the Russian world supporters, who claimed they were so worried about Donbas, that they felt so sorry for the residents of Donbas, and that they needed to be defended immediately? Why did they curse and demonize Ukrainians for allegedly shelling Donbas residents, yet when their own general, who admitted it himself, who openly says, Yes, I gave the order. They were shelled. A woman and a child were killed. They aren't demanding that he be brought to trial, so it's all right for their own troops. When the Russian military kills residents of Donbas, let them kill, as if they don't care about those Donbas residents. But if it's the Ukrainians, and there's no evidence, yes, that the Ukrainians were killing, because they later attributed such shelling to the Ukrainians. They later said that when someone like General Gurulev was shooting at and killing people, they would then scream that it was all the fascists' fault, that the Ukrainians did it all. Oh my, really? I mean, look, here's how it is. And their own General Gurulev, who is in Russia, who basically confessed to a crime, because he illegally invaded the territory of another country with his army. And back then, it wasn't like that yet. If right now there's an order and Putin has given the order for this military operation, yes, then back then it was sneakily, that is, basically unofficially, it's a crime even according to Russian laws. And he admits that he killed a woman with a child and gave that order. So where's the responsibility? I don't see anyone rushing to put him behind bars for killing the residents of Donbas. Somehow, nobody in Russia seems to care about these Donbas residents. I will not be surprised if they've even put the child's name on this Alley of Angels, and now they're portraying it as a victim of Poroshenko, or a victim of Ukrainian punitive forces. Look at what they've done. I am sure that, in general, most of the casualties attributed to Ukraine are actually people who died as a result of shelling like this, which includes shelling by Russian forces, the Russian army, or some militants, yes. And remember, back then they were screaming, like, what is this? We are firing on ourselves. That can't be true. The militias wouldn't shoot at their own homes or fire on Donbas themselves. The Russians wouldn't fire. We are defenders, we are protecting. But the Ukrainian fascists, they're the ones firing on the people of Donbas. And now, some time has passed, and it's becoming clear who is actually firing. And look, once again, we don't have to prove anything. We don't have to make anything up or spread slander. Here's a Russian general admitting to everything himself. A heartfelt confession. And I'm sure this is just, say, 1% of what they actually did. Yes, of what he specifically did. He's confessed to this, so to speak. Yes, he'll never reveal the rest, but even this is enough to get a rough idea of what they were doing, how they were doing it, and how they treat these people. Because none of the Russians feel any sorry for those Donbas residents whom they themselves killed, and none of them are demanding that anyone be punished for this, nor are they in any way demanding that those truly responsible be held accountable. Please, friends, be sure to share this information. This is very important to us. Let's make sure as many people as possible see and know the truth about what happened back then, so that no one can ever say again that it didn't happen. Also, in Ukraine, there were sold-out politicians like that who claimed there was no Russian army there, and that it was all just an internal conflict, a civil war. Please share these testimonies so that in the future no one can ever pretend this didn't happen, and so that everyone knows what really happened and who those punitive forces actually were, the ones who killed the residents of Donbas. And subscribe to the channel. That's very important, too.